that first set, and then we'll. Okay, Griffin, scene one, take one, Mark.
I guess there are a lot of different ways to answer that question. There are so many factors in our personal lives and in our society that are at work here, and I guess all the gears are moving at the same time. How do you analyze which ones are the most important ones? So I guess I would have to start with the largest wheels in the machine. And the largest wheels would probably be our culture. And the second maybe would be our political system. And then our family, and then our individual, something like that. You'll get the idea. We go from the big to the small. Our culture has been under attack for a long time. And what we see in this era with COVID-19 impacting our lives, it couldn't have impacted it in the way it has unless our culture has been prepared, so to speak, or softened or bent or weakened in some way. I think anybody, whether they think it's for good or for evil, would admit that our culture has changed considerably in the last several generations, let's say in the last 100 years. It's changed tremendously. And whether it's for good or bad, of course, is an element of debate. But it certainly has changed in a way that it has set up the attitude of the people of the world to accept regimentation and control from the top, much more so, I think, than it has in the past. Now, in the past, cultures have been willing to accept that kind of absolute control from the top down because of religious convictions. For example, a lot of cultures are theocratic in nature. Systems, political systems are theocratic, but it's because the culture is theocratic. So under the very old concepts that God was in charge of everything and these rules come down from heaven and we must obey them because they're, divine. That was found in old cultures, but and we had a strong element of that in our culture when America and the Western civilization it took its final form. It was an element of that, but it was not compulsory. It was more something you should do. It's something you should want to do, and you still had freedom of choice to accept or reject. But now, to the question, in the last 100 years or so, all cultures have drifted or perhaps rushed toward a change in which the attitude is that we not only, if we should do something, then we must do something. And there should be a power, an authority of some kind that can force people to do something. There's a name for that. It's collectivism. And people have been imbued with this idea of collectivism, that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual is, must be sacrificed if necessary for the greater good of the greater number. This is an ideological concept that has been pushed into all the cultures of the world to one degree or another, and particularly in the Western world because it started off so far from that position. So I think the first thing in answering your question is that the culture and the people's attitudes, it was prepared for it. If this had happened 100 years ago, I don't think that there would have been so much compliance and so much passivity involved. People might have been forced to do certain things at the point of a bayonet or something like that, or a sword, but they wouldn't have been eagerly going around and saying, "Oh, I can hardly wait to obey and get in line for a vaccine or something," or I have to. They're convinced that they do these things because they should, because it's for their own good. So I think that's the first thing. If you look at that cultural background, people are ready for it in their mind. It seems like the proper and normal thing to do. You move to the political system, now you have a little variation and a refinement of that same concept. There are people who we would call politicians or leaders who have figured out that this is perhaps a way of controlling society to convince people that they should obey not just the mores of society, but obey the rules and laws of their government. And so now we get to something very specific where there are individuals who sort of ride the crest of that passivity to rules and regulations, and they say, okay, if this is good, we're going to pass a law. Now we have the law, we've got the courts, and we've got the police system and the armies, and we're going to enforce these things with physical force. And so then we come to the question of how do they do that? And maybe that's a topic for a later discussion, but in a word, they do it because of fear. These people who are consciously changing the culture and consciously changing the political system, they're doing it for a reason, and that is so that they can control society. Not for the society's good, but for their personal gain. And let's face it, that really is the motivation of most people that seek political dominance and political professionalism and so forth. They really want to control. Now, they may think it's for the benefit of society, or they may not, but they all say that they do. So they find out that the way to get people to say, yes, I'm going to obey because I want to obey, even though I don't want to do it, I'm going to do it anyway because it's for my own good. It's for the good of society. I've been taught that in school. My culture teaches it to me, and so I believe it. And so people will line up and do what they're told because, not because they want to do it, but because they think they should do it. It's for their own good. So that's where the political system comes into play, and that's the enforcement mechanism. And then, of course, we come down to the family level. The family used to be the source of guidance for these things. What did the family decide? Was the head of the family, the dominant members of the family? That's pretty well been splintered in our present day. That took about 100 years for that to happen, too. All of these things were happening parallel. So we can't turn to the family. The churches have been pretty well changed also. They used to have independent, firm principles, religious views, and now it's sort of a blend. Let's all get together and believe the same thing, and you know, there's a lot of defection from religious loyalties. People still go to church, of course. They put money in the basket, but they don't wrap their lives. Well, many people do, of course, but I mean, it's not as prominent as it was, so people don't turn to the family, they don't turn to their churches for guidance on these things. They only have one thing left, and that's the state. I think those are the changes that I see that conditioned society, conditioned almost everybody in the world to be ready for what happened and this COVID theater that came along. I call it theater. It tells you pretty much what I think about it. I don't think that the reality is what we've been told. I think it's theater to frighten us. And of course, there's nothing more frightening than a pandemic of a germ or a virus or something we can't even see, the enemy, and it's lurking everywhere. And so we have to do what we're told by the experts in order to save our very lives and to save our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our neighbors and everything. So it's the ideal ploy to play upon these conditions that have been building for 2 or 3 or 4 generations. So we're now ready for it. I think that the fact that the colleges and universities of the modern time are a lot less focused on a scholarly excellence and reading, writing, and arithmetic, as they like to say, but that includes philosophy and science and psychology and all of those things, is more focused today on social behavior, what is the correct thing to do for society. It's social engineering rather than real intellectual preparedness. The fact that that has happened is obviously devastating to the ability of the graduates of these institutions to use the full impact of their intellect because they're not trained to do that. They're trained to think a certain way and to act in a certain way without considering necessarily the logic behind it. They're just trained to do it because that's what you should do. That's how we bring about the proper society. So it's a social training instrument instead of an educational instrument. And I think it's obvious that a society which has a system like that is going to deny itself of the great minds that normally would be available for other more constructive purposes. I'm assuming that there are more constructive purposes, of course. I would love to defend that point of view at some other time, but I think it's obvious that there are a lot of other constructive purposes in the field of art and psychology and science and literature and philosophy and so forth. So I think that's obvious, but I think there's another part to it that's not so obvious, and that is that even an uneducated person, one that's never been to school at all, has a certain instinctive concept of what is right and what is wrong. And there's an instinct for personal property. It's wrapped up with the mating instinct. I discovered in my own studies that the mating instinct is almost a part and parcel of the property imperative. You know, all higher levels of animals, mammals in particular, have this territorial imperative. They want to have their own territory, and they have a mate, and then they defend the children, the offspring, in that territory, and they have an instinct for property. They have an instinct for justice, and a lot of instincts that occur even at the lower level in many animal kingdoms, and certainly it's obvious in the human species. And so there are certain built-in instincts. And people today hate to acknowledge instincts. They say, "Oh, instinct is a question of culture. We can breed out or train out an instinct," which I don't think is possible. They can override it, but they can't get rid of it. So anyway, I believe that there are instincts. That's the point. And I think even for a person who's not a graduate of a university or college has these instincts for the things that are right. But the young people that are going through these educational institutions today are being told, don't listen to your instincts. Your concept of right and wrong, of morality and human rights and things like that, those are just constructs of society. And if we think about it, we can figure out why you shouldn't follow them because they're false. Your parents gave them to you, or your culture gave them to you, and so forth. So I think what the real danger, I think, is in the present educational system is the growth of the idea that human nature can and should be changed by the state, changed so that they give up certain important concepts like the human right called property and the fact that we do have human rights, and freedom of speech is one of them, and all those things. So I think it's a question of not getting the reading, writing, and arithmetic part of it, but the fact that our morality and our judgments and our question of what is right and wrong is also being contoured in this same system, and that to me is even more devastating to the future. There's no question that fear is probably the most powerful force that drives human action. You could analyze and say, well, maybe vengeance, or maybe hatred, or maybe hunger, or maybe the mating instinct. All of these things are powerful drives, of course, but when fear comes, it usually dominates, I believe. And it overrides any rational thought. If you think you're going to die, nothing else matters. You're focused totally on how you can survive. I think that's important to keep in mind because fear can be generated falsely by a false narrative. People can be told that something is going to happen that's very bad. And if they believe it, they'll be afraid of it, even though it's an invented scenario. It's happened a lot in our personal lives and happen in national histories and so forth. I mean, you tell a little kid that there's a boogeyman underneath the bed, and if he doesn't eat his spinach or his porridge or go to bed and go to sleep, that boogeyman's going to come out and get him. The kid is scared to death, He believes there's a boogeyman underneath the bed or in the closet or whatever it is. And it's so fear. I think every parent knows that they can use a little bit of scare tactics. If you don't do this, Papa's going to really whop you. And of course, Papa never whops him, but he raises the hand, and sometimes he whops him. But you get the idea that it's the fear that's more important than the actual punishment. So there are social scientists today that have written textbooks on this, and they've all studied this. It's a science. So if you want to control people's activities and even their thoughts today, all you have to do is scare them. And it doesn't make too much difference whether the threat that you're using to scare them is real or fabricated. As long as they believe it's real, that's all that's important. There was a book that came out, I think it was in the 70s, called, or thereabouts, it was The Report from Iron Mountain. And it was pretended, I don't think it was, but it was said to be written by a think tank. In Irvington-on-Hudson, I think it was, some think tank sponsored by the Pentagon, as how to control society and keep them, keep them from rebelling against their governments. The phrase they used in that was, how do you stabilize society? That was supposedly the purpose of this study. How does one stabilize existing systems? And of course, when you read their explanation of what stabilize means, it meant that how do you prevent downtrodden people from rebelling against their tyrannical governments? And so the whole book was about how do you get people to accept tyranny without rebelling? And it was a very scholarly study of, well, you just have to scare them from one thing or another and convince them that they better buckle down and follow their leaders, or otherwise they're going to be invaded by some foreign nation, or there's going to be something terrible that will happen. And they even talk about the possibility of saying that maybe the environment is going to be destroyed. There's maybe, environmentalism, the planet is going to be destroyed, and your children and your grandchildren won't live anymore the way they should. They talked about terrorism, various things that they could, either invent completely or take whatever really was there and blow it up way out of proportions to frighten people. They didn't mention pandemics, but I think they could have if they had thought at that time, had they known there was technology to control and invent viruses and other types of pathogens and so forth. But the whole purpose of this study was to describe the ways in which people could be scared into obedience and compliance, passive compliance with the tyrannical government. And their conclusion was at that time was there's nothing better than war. So therefore, all governments should be constantly either involved in a war or planning for a war or preparing for a war or afraid of somebody attacking them, so that the population will always be on the edge of this fear that something terrible is going to happen to them. So I mention that because that's the trick. That's the trick that's been used, probably for the last, I'm going to say it started in World War I. Actually, before that. Go back to the book, The Prince, written by Machiavelli. And in the book, Machiavelli says to the prince, if your population is unruly and becoming restless, and they think the taxes are too high or your regulations are too severe, involve them in a war or rumors of war, he says, and then they will be patriotically obligated to follow you and not complain over their plight. So there you have it. It's a simple rule. It's logical. It's just hard for people to believe that there are leaders that we vote for and that we support and that we like that actually would use that against the population as a calculated strategy for control. But that's a naive dream to think that that wouldn't happen, because the nature of politics for a long time has been how to deceive people into doing exactly that. And of course, fear is the major weapon of deception to create obedience to a tyrannical government. Well, propaganda has a good side and a bad side. Most people think it's bad, but if you go to the dictionary and read what it really says, it's not necessarily bad. It merely means a program or a statement in which you present an idea in its most favorable way possible. It doesn't necessarily mean to lie or to deceive. It just means to put your best foot forward, you know. A salesman can sell a product without lying about it, but he'll certainly build up all of the positive qualities of it. He may forget to mention some of the shortcomings of it, but everything he says is true, and you know, if he's a good salesman, he won't lie about it. So propaganda is simply a presentation of an idea in its most favorable way. However, in real life, propaganda is usually associated with deceit, because that's what often happens either in a commercial environment in which a manufacturer is selling a product and he wants to hide the fact that the product really isn't any good at all, or it actually may have some negative qualities. So he'll exaggerate, and he'll say that, well, this vaccine has been tested and it's safe and effective, when in fact it has been tested, all right, but it was proven to be unsafe and ineffective, but they hide that information. That too is propaganda. That's the kind of propaganda you find in warfare, where you're fighting an enemy and you always present your enemy as the mean killer is going to rape the women and kill the babies and slaughter the dogs and steal everything, and they create pictures of this sort of thing. And not to say that those things don't happen, because they do, but the propaganda is where they create those scenes and blow it way up out of reality, and for the sole purpose of scaring people. So we're back to the issue of fear again. If you can use propaganda to create fear, which is often the case, now you've got a double whammy there. And so you've not only presented your enemy in the most unfavorable light possible, but the implication is that you or your side is not that way, and therefore we must fight to the death to protect our homeland against this evil person and so forth, or this evil nation, or this evil army, or this evil force. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's really true. Sometimes those people, the conquerors or the invaders, are of that nature. But quite often the propaganda goes far beyond reality, and its purpose is not just to present reality, but to present an emotional reaction on the part of the viewer, to drive their own people to a harder and more dedicated support of their own leaders, without question of anything that might be wrong within their own leadership. Okay, Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points, and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. As soon as you sacrifice this slogan and try to be many-sided, the effect will piddle away, for the crowd can neither digest nor retain the material offered. In this way, the result is weakened, and in the end, entirely canceled out. Okay, I remember reading that, yes, and that's Adolf Hitler. And it's interesting, I think, from a couple of perspectives. First of all, this is not the normal ranting that one expects from Adolf Hitler. They expect him to be talking to the masses. In this case, he's teaching his followers and how to manipulate the masses. So he reveals the other side of him. This is closer to Adolf Hitler's real personality. He's a student. He's a student of psychology and mass movements. He's a brilliant student of that, I'm sorry to say. He understood human weaknesses very well and understood how to use those weaknesses against the individual. I remember thinking, this is really interesting. This guy had it all figured out. He talked about the value of everybody wearing a uniform. The uniform gave them a certain identity, a unity, just to have all the same uniform, and to have rank with stripes on your shoulder, and the officers with shiny emblems of their rank, and to give people medals and awards and recognition ceremonies and so forth, to get them emotionally and psychologically, in tune with you and your movement. He talked about all of these things, and the value of martial music at an event to get the spirits up. And so he was a psychologist. So what I'm reading here is Adolf Hitler at his prime. And he does understand that if you want to lead the masses, don't try and explain too much to them. Just give them a slogan, like, well, I won't even say what came to mind, but all politicians, especially, I'm thinking of the American scene now. Think of every president in your lifetime that's run for office. They've had a slogan, haven't they? And I'm here to say that those slogans were designed by propagandists. They were not even dreamed up by the candidate himself. He paid probably a lot of money, or somebody paid a lot of money for a team of marketing specialists to dream up slogans. Well, what do the people want to hear, Well, let's see. They like this, this, and this, and they'll try it. And the ones with the best response say that that's the slogan we'll use for our man. They sometimes do that even before the candidate is selected. So once you get that slogan, you just repeat it over and over and over again. You don't change slogans. It's with you forever because the public, as Hitler says, is not interested in thinking too deeply. I'm sorry to say, he's right in that. Most people aren't. I'll come back to that in a second. So you don't confuse them. You don't ask them to think. You just give them a slogan that feels good, that sounds good, and that's the purpose that it serves. Now, it's true that most people don't want to go too deeply into this thing. But a few people do, and those are the ones that really are important. And he's talking not to the masses that don't want to think deeply. He's talking to the leaders of the Nazi movement who will lead those masses. And those leaders represent 1% or less percent of the population. And it points up an important fact, and that is that any movement, whether it's for good or bad, for Hitler or for Stalin or for anybody, its success depends on the strength and the dedication and the power of that 1% or less of the population, not the masses. The masses, unfortunately, will always follow the winner. So in the game of politics, in the game of the world, the idea is not to educate the masses, unfortunately. It's how to fool the masses or give the masses something easy to follow. And it's that 1% on either side that are fighting it out with propaganda, mostly, to capture the instincts and the loyalties of the other 99%. That's Adolf Hitler at his worst. Is communism taking over America? I would say if we understand what communism is, the answer is it took it over a long time ago. Now, what do I mean by if we understand what it is? Communism, in my view, is merely one variant, among others, of something called collectivism. It's the idea that the group is more important than the individual. Communism is collectivism. Fascism is collectivism. Nazism is collectivism. All of these concepts, I don't care what name they choose for themselves. It might even be, unfortunately, somebody might say it's Americanism now, or New Dealism, or the Green Agendaism, or something. If you analyze what's underneath the label, and you find that the philosophy or the ideology says that the individual must be controlled for the benefit of the masses, for the benefit of the group, and the individual must be sacrificed, then the leaders of the group, the party leaders and so forth, of the masses, the majority, they're the ones who will lead. That's collectivism. And that idea has taken over America a long time ago. Well, I think the idea of crisis and the fear that comes from crisis is the tactic or the general engine that has caused Americans and people all around the world to be passive as one by one their liberties are being stripped away from them. They're not standing up and fighting. They just let them go. They say, oh, yeah, well, there goes another one. There goes another liberty. Oh, I can't do this now. Oh, what's next? Why are they so passive? It's because they're afraid. They think they have to do that. We're back to this question of fear again. That's how they've done it. And people are convinced that if they don't let these liberties be taken from them, then something very horrible is going to happen to America, to their children, to their grandchildren, and to themselves. So they do it only because they've been fooled. That's the bottom line. They have bought the propaganda. They've been fooled. They believe that something is real that is not real. They believe there's a threat that is either not existent, or if it's existent, it was deliberately created by the very people who now want to take their liberties from them. That's the reality. And it's hard for people to realize that we're in that kind of a condition where there is such massive deceit being achieved right under our noses and we cannot see it. And the reason we cannot see it is because it's so monstrous that nobody could believe that could be successful. Adolf Hitler had something to say on that, too. He said that if you want to tell a lie and have the masses believe it, make sure it's a big lie and tell it often enough. And they will never conceive that such a big lie that's told so often could be wrong. I think I should start talking about masks and why they're behavioral reminders by saying I don't believe that the masks are serving the purpose that most people think they are. Now, I could be right or wrong on that. That's not the point at the moment. But my view is that masks are mostly psychological and they have zero benefit medically to protect people against any disease, any pathogen. And actually, I believe that they have negative effect because they create conditions that are unhealthy, even for healthy people. But that aside, in my view, I see the mask as a symbol of conformity to the lie, a symbol that everybody agrees with the lie. Otherwise, they wouldn't be wearing the mask. And if everybody agrees that it must be true, you see, there's that idea of, does everybody agree? Is it consensus? If it's consensus, well, I guess so. We've been trained to think that. If you've got the majority or a huge majority believing something, it must be true, when in fact it's usually just the opposite. So I think it's in the same category as going through the metal detectors and the TSA lines at the airport. There's no real evidence that there's a threat of terrorism on our planes. I mean, unless you go back to 9/11 and you want to buy that story exactly as it's been told to you. But even if you buy that, nothing has happened since. But people go through the lines, and so every time they go through, Lord, I guess the threat of terrorism must be real because look, everybody's going through these metal detectors and we're getting shaken. So it must be real, right? Because everybody goes through the motions and gives credence to it by their acceptance of it. So those lines are psychological more than anything else. Masks are psychological more than anything else. So we're back to the theme that psychology is really the weapon of warfare today. I think the merit of getting the kids out of the government indoctrinational system is self-evident, even if it were not the government indoctrination system. If it were any other non-government indoctrination system, we'd want to get the kids out of it, right? Unless, of course, it's our indoctrinational system. If we want to teach our kids our views, as we do, because we think they're the best views, those who don't agree with us would say, well, we're indoctrinating our kids. And in fact, we are. And so it's a question of whose indoctrination is going to prevail. Is it going to be yours with your kids, or are you going to let somebody else indoctrinate your kids? Somebody is going to teach/indoctrinate your kids. So whether it's the question of the government, or whether it's a question of a private school, or a question of homeschooling, that is not really the issue. The issue is, what are the ideologies, the ideas, the concepts, the moral concepts, the values being taught? It's not so much who teaches them, but what they are. You see, what I'm trying to say is that you can take your kids out of the government school system, throw them into a private school, and they'll get the same thing because you didn't dream that the teachers in the private school came out of the same indoctrination centers and universities that the ones in the government school did. And you find, oh my gosh, they're teaching them basically the same thing in this nice religious school I sent them to. They're teaching them not to respect religion. They're teaching them atheism in a religious school. And it happens, by the way, and the parents think, how did that happen? It's because they're focused so much on who's teaching rather than what is being taught. So my answer to that question is yes. I think the government school system is the most apt to be teaching the wrong things because it comes under the hands of political control. Political control is notoriously corrupt. It always has been. And for a lot of obvious reasons, it probably always will be because it's a source of power and money. And as such, it's a magnet against a magnet that draws into it the predator class from all over the world. Everybody wants to go work for the government because that way you can steal legally and put people in prison that try to expose you. That's not a bad deal if you're a crook. So they all go into government. So I would say the governments are probably the least likely place you'd want your kids to go to school. But if you'd put them anyplace else, you better be careful just as well to make sure that they're not getting information and ideas that you don't want. Well, the Great Reset is a slogan. It's a slogan that sounds like it's good. It's like resetting your watch, right? Or resetting your speedometer back to zero again. We're going to start over again. So that's the idea. The Great Reset doesn't really mean anything unless you put meaning to it. Now, I know what Klaus Schwab, who's I guess he's the chairman or the founder of the World Economic Forum, I think that was basically his idea. Perhaps it was thought up by some public relations people, I don't know, but it was Schwab that actually introduced the idea of the Great Reset. It sounds good. But in my way, I call it the Great Reset to feudalism, because that is more to my understanding of what we're talking about. What are we resetting, and what are we resetting it to is the question that should be raised. Well, okay, as I see reading the material of not only the World Economic Forum, but all of the satellite organizations that go to Davos with these people and they talk about these things and they write papers on it, and they're all in pretty much agreement. If you put them all together in the pot, what you get is that the Great Reset that they have in mind is the elimination of what you might call free enterprise capitalism, the elimination of what is more correctly, I believe, called individualism as a form of society, and replacing it with collectivism. In other words, they want to eliminate all personal liberties and convert the world into kind of an anthill or a beehive in which there is strong regimented control from the top down, always in the name of the greater good of the greater number. It's always for the good of the worker bees or the worker ants. It's for their good, you understand. But still, nevertheless, they will be regimented, and that'll be the end of it. That's what the Great Reset really means to these people. And so they're going to get rid of all private property. Schwab says, in a few years, you will have no property, and you will be happy. He says, he really believes that. No, you won't have any property in the Great Reset under collectivism. It'll all be state-owned, and you'll be given a place to live and food and shelter. As long as you're a good boy and a girl and you do exactly as you're told, you'll be fine. But if you question or step out of line, you're through. And so that's the kind of a beehive society that they're talking about when they say the Great Reset. Huge, huge debt. Well, first of all, the debt is not really a bailout. Some of it is. They're bailing out the banks traditionally and the large corporations. And the reason they bail out the large corporations is because they owe money to the banks. So that's why the corporations get bailed out. And the money goes back to the banks. People have no idea how central the banking system is to our problems. There's an old slogan I wish people would remember it: follow the money. If you do that, you can figure out things pretty fast. So when we have this huge debt and these bailouts, where does the money go? Well, first of all, it's created out of nothing by the banking system called the Federal Reserve System. The debt comes into being, but it's the only thing back of the debt is the debt instrument, which is the IOU. But that becomes money in our circulation. It's not too important to understand that here, but money for loans and grants is in our world created literally out of nothing except debt. So all of this money comes into existence, and it goes into society to help the people who are supporting the political structure. The ones who are, the corporations that get the bailouts, that get the special deals, the contracts. It goes into the educational system. It goes in. Whoever gets a grant. We all get money now from Social Security. Now that's coming into play. We're going to get bigger and bigger checks, and people are going to be so happy. We get free money from the government, and they don't realize that the whole reason for that system is that the more dependent you are on the government for your livelihood, the less you can resist what the government tells you to do. And when you get to the point of the Great Reset, as they want to call it, where you are totally dependent upon the government for your livelihood and the money you get and where you live and education and your health care and clothing and shelter and food and all this stuff, if you're totally dependent, you are totally the slave. You're totally a slave. And so that's why this process of bailing out the corporations so they can pay off their debt to the banks is destroying employment, it's destroying industry, it's destroying the instinct of independence on the part of the worker. People just want to stay home now and play games on their computer. Heck, we don't need to do anything. We get money in the mail, And the more we get that attitude, the less productivity there will be. And there comes a point when the whole system collapses like a house of cards because nobody's producing anything. Nobody has to. They just have to obey and they get what they want. They don't have to produce anything. And the day will come when they say, well, you will produce today. You will go out and make bricks or something like that. They don't see that part of it. But so what will that destroy America? Of course it will destroy America as we have known it. America will still exist, but it'll become a slave island, become a slave continent. That's not the America that I was born into, and that's not the America I want. And so it becomes obvious that the more money we get and the more money the government is anxious to give to us, and the more we get hooked on that, why, then the more control they have over us. We have lost our complete independence. No longer is the government our servant, but we are the servant to the government. Whoever pays the piper calls the tune. So that's the process we're seeing. Will the U.S. dollar eventually collapse, I think, is a real easy question, and the answer is yes, it has to, because it has no substance. The only thing that really supports the U.S. dollar and the world economy today is its military power. If any country refuses to accept U.S. dollars for oil in particular, that's the euro dollar, they like to call that process. If they won't accept U.S. dollars as the denomination of choice in oil purchases, why all of a sudden they're invaded by the U.S. Marines and it's called a terrorist country, and they could well be a terrorist country. But the one next to them, which is also a terrorist country that does accept U.S. dollars in the oil market, they're not invaded. They're okay. They come to the White House and they're treated okay. So the U.S. dollar already really is nothing more than the token of influence by the U.S. military. And once that relationship is not there, and it's hard to imagine when it won't be, but eventually it will weaken. If it ever comes to the point, as it's foreseeable, that we couldn't even support our own military, that too is too expensive. We don't have enough productivity to support our own military, even in our own country, much less around the world. And if other nations like China and Russia and some people that can hardly wait to trample on our grave, and they'll do everything they can to hasten that process, then the U.S. dollar has nothing to back it. And at that point, it could be the end of our way of life. The world is not drifting toward digital currencies, it's rushing toward it. It's been on the boards for a long, long time, and now the technology is in place and the machinery is in place to make it happen. And I think we've already seen it in some vestigial form. We've got cryptocurrencies now. We've got Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all these coins coming along. And they're talking about blockchain transactions for real estate sales and all that kind of thing. It's upon us already. It's just a question now of developing it and filling it out and making it more user-friendly so that the average guy can use it. Right now, it's still very difficult to use cryptocurrency. But all of the major banks are in the trenches, working hard to develop cryptocurrencies of their own. And the IMF and the Federal Reserve are working hard to create an international exchange of cryptocurrencies so it can be all unified into one master network which can be controlled from one point. So yes, they're all working in that direction. So we are rushing in that direction. And I just want to say that although it's been sold to us in the beginning as a means of breaking the grip of governments and banks, this is one of the great illusions of our time, because the cashless society has always been the great dream of totalitarian governments and their world banks. The cashless society means that people are completely dependent upon the goodwill of their governments to survive. They'll get tokens or numbers or units or credit scores or something to survive. And if they can't have any currency to hide under the bed or put in their pockets, they can't escape the system. They're in the system for everything. So the cashless society has always been a dream of totalitarian governments. And the digital system is the path to a cashless society. China's model of social credit and surveillance is coming to America. In fact, it's already here to some extent in its early stages. When China first announced that it was using the social credit and high surveillance system, which was what I guess from probably first time I heard it was about 2018 or something like that, immediately I noticed that in the press there were people from our banking institutions and in our government saying, well, that's a good idea. We should look into that. I thought, well, here it comes. Now, of course, we passed that yardstick a long time ago. They're actively promoting it right now. So, yep, it's due. That's the model that they want to have. Social credit system and surveillance is how they will regiment us if we give them the chance to do that. I think we're talking about the same thing under different words, using different words for it. I think the end game for the UN Agenda 21 and 2030 and the Great Reset, these are different words to describe pretty much the same thing. It's global government, or they like to call it governance, because they see a means of control much bigger than just government. They like to think in terms of non-governmental organizations, so-called, industry and educational institutions, and people who are not in hardcore government, but who play a role in this governance. And they do indeed play a role. So it's bigger than even government. And so we see that talk everywhere. And you find it at the UN, you find it at the World Economic Forum, you find it in the schools, you find it in churches. Everybody's using the same vocabulary, and they actually, I think, are all talking about the same thing, which is a world system of human control based on the model of collectivism. Yeah, Bill Gates has said this in many ways, and I've seen him say it a couple of times in different interviews. But essentially, he says, eventually we will have some digital certificates to show who has received or who has been tested recently, or when we have a vaccine, who has received it. Well, that's how he describes it. He's heavily invested not only in the vaccines, but heavily invested in the technology of these patches, which will create a certificate. The certificate, I don't think he's talking so much about a piece of paper. He's talking about a digital certificate which is backed up in a computer somewhere, which says yes or no, John Jones is vaccinated, or he has his current vaccination, up to March 15 of this year, and then all that record will be digitally restored in the cloud somewhere. And of course, he has a patent in the information that'll put these tattoos on people's arms, which not only inject the vaccines, but also leave a tattoo, which can be read by a smartphone, and that triggers the digital certificate. You see how they've got it all planned so that everywhere you go, you're going to have to display your arm, and they can say, aha, you're overdue for your next vaccine. You can't buy this watermelon, or you can't get on this plane. And that's what we're talking about. He's in the middle of both sides of that, will benefit immensely from it because, they're talking about making not just trillions, but trillions of dollars from this technology. I think the best way for the American people to stop the movement toward collectivism is to stop asking for it, to stop demanding it, to stop accepting it from their political leaders. They don't know the word collectivism, most of them. They don't really understand what it means. All they know is that, well, the idea of the group being very important, and we all sacrifice for the group, America first, that's the group more than an individual. We got to sacrifice for our country. We got to sacrifice for the United States. It's all, we got to sacrifice, do what the majority wants, however you want to say it. That's an idea that was taught to us in school. I say us because I was taught it in school. From each according to our ability, to each according to our need, was a slogan devised by Marx. And it sounded good to me. Why not? The majority should rule, shouldn't it? All these things, the greater good or the greater number sounds so good. And that's the foundation of collectivism. But what they don't ask is how. How are we going to serve the greater good of the greater number? They don't realize that the greater good of the greater number can be served only by preserving the rights of the individual. That's the greater good of the greater number. Once you start sacrificing the individual for, the numbers game, well, then individuals are sacrificed. And that's all there is in this world, individuals. There are no groups. You can't touch a group. You can't even see a group. You can see individuals and touch individuals. It's like the word forest. Forest doesn't exist. It's an abstraction in the mind. You can touch a tree, you can cut down a tree, but you can't cut down many trees. You can only cut down trees, but not the forest. It's an abstraction of the mind. So when you realize that you're placing an abstraction that doesn't really exist, the rights of an abstraction above the rights of a human being that's real, you made a huge mistake. Because then some demagogue is going to come along and he'll say, I speak for the people. I speak for the party. And we must rule to the benefit of mankind. And you 9 million people over there have got to be exterminated. This kind of thing. That's the basis of collectivism. You can get away with anything under collectivism, any crime, as long as you say it's for the greater good of the greater number. So back to the question, how do we stop moving toward collectivism? Is first of all, the people of the world have to understand what it is. And that's where our role, I think, is so critical right now. It's our job to explain it. It's never been explained before. It's not being taught in schools. So it's our job to explain it. And I think most people, once they understand that collectivism is at the heart of most, if not all, of our major problems in the world today, they will get rid of it. So I would say the first and perhaps the most important step is to help people in the world to understand that our problem is collectivism. But the next step is just as important, is what are you going to do about it? Now you've got to get off of your couches and start taking an active interest in the political system and clean out of public office all those collectivists there who are dreaming of just how to control you for the greater good of the greater number. As long as those people are in positions of authority and power, we can never make the transition. But we can't make the transition and get rid of those people until, first of all, the public understands the need to get rid of them. So there's our two-step program, education and then political action. I think how we disrupt the Great Reset is pretty much how we prevent collectivism from happening in America. It's the same thing, really. The Great Reset is the building of an international order of collectivism. So it's really basically the same question, I would say.
All right, J. Griffin, Scene 1, Take 2, Mark.
So the question arises what to do about all of this. And for many people coming across the facts that we're discussing here today, it's a hard step to take, to acknowledge that there might be some truth to it. Because it's a step that goes from comfort and trust in our leadership, trust in our system. It goes from that comfortable spot to distrust and questioning and instability, insecurity. Oh my gosh, you mean I'm responsible now for my own safety? I've got to step against the masses. I've got to step out and be different from everybody. I've got to be in the group that is described as a bunch of wackos and all. I got to do that? No, I'm not going to do that. I'd rather die than do that. Well, it's hard. I know I had a little trouble with that myself years ago. But I think the answer is that once you understand that you have been fooled on a very important issue, no matter what it is. In my case, I discovered that the United Nations was not at all what I had been taught it was in school. Not at all, just the opposite of everything. It was a hard red pill to swallow. But I finally did it, and once I realized that, well, that was propaganda and that these guys are really not what they're pretending to be and all that, it was easier to see the same tricks being used the next time in some other issue. And then the next one was even easier. It's like, I guess they say the first crack in an egg is always the hardest. After that, the egg crumbles pretty fast. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody go out and just try and crumble their egg, their ideas and beliefs and their comfort and just crumble it to pieces. No, but what I am saying is that once you understand that the world is not necessarily exactly as you've been told, your eyes will open. Don't be afraid of it, because at least if you're like I am, you'll find that it's much better to know the truth, even though it's unpleasant truth, than to live in a dream world and be surprised and overtaken by the horrible events of society. You can't do anything about it unless you understand its reality. So you have to have, I think, a mindset to be open to the idea of, okay, maybe, just maybe, I have to do something about it. Maybe I have to take on the role that I never wanted to take on, which is the role of a crusader and a warrior, somebody who speaks up and defends the truth even when it's unpopular. That's a personal decision everybody has to make. But I think once anyone thinks about it at great length, there comes a realization that, no, you have to stand for truth no matter what it is. Don't be afraid of it. I don't think the answer is just going out and being belligerent and hugging somebody and having a good time and partying and all that stuff. That's surface. The first thing is come to an understanding of who you are. What is your role? Do you have an obligation to yourself, to your family, to your country, to the world? Are you here for something bigger than just survival and just having a good time? Or are you here to do something important and to defend truth and liberty? If you think on that, meditate on that, I believe the answer will come and you'll know what to do then.
Jibber Griffin, scene 1, take 3, Mark. Nailed it, Ed. All done.
All done?
All done. You did it.
All right, where's my paycheck?
Right.